Hello, hope you're doing well, and welcome to the video. As many of you all may have seen lately, I have been very busy over the past few weeks and months with various projects, and because of that, it feels like it's been absolutely ages since I last just got stuck in and made a properly big speed paint video like this. So much so, in fact, that I almost don't know where to begin. But I suppose I should start off by letting you guys know that today's video is sponsored by Clip Studio Paint. You might remember that name from my very first video of this year, which had a bunch of tips and tricks for making black and white manga pages. But for those of you who haven't heard of Clip Studio before, it is a multifaceted art software that comes equipped with all the tools you might need for illustration, manga creation, animation, and a whole lot more. Personally, I've actually been trying to use it more and more often these days since I've started getting back into comic making. So when Clip Studio got in touch with me again recently and said that they'd like for me to show you guys some more of my Clip Studio comic creating process, I was really excited to get the chance to explore more of the features and get a bit more practice in. Seeing as how last time around I went over the process for making a black and white manga page, today I wanted to add an extra challenge and try to make a full color comic page instead. And to add insult to injury, I have never done any coloring with Clip Studio before. I've only ever dabbled in line work and a bit of grayscale, some screen tones at most, so this is going to be a journey of discovery for all of us. And even though I am basically going into the main portion of this creative journey completely blind, I do at least know that the first step is choosing what to draw. Now, truth be told, at first I wasn't quite sure what to draw for this one since, whenever I do more experimenty and comic-focused videos like this in particular, I really enjoy finding examples of my old work and remaking them, because being able to see the side-by-side, like before and after, is really satisfying. And at first, I couldn't think of a single example of anything I might have had in my old art folders that could fit the bill for what I wanted to do in this video. But then, I remembered the very first video that I ever uploaded to this channel. The reason, in fact, that I made this channel in the first place, if you can believe it. It was a questionably edited 30-second long trailer for a comic that I made as part of my final university project all the way back in 2017. And to this day, it is the only comic that I've ever made single-handed that has been produced in full color. Its name was West, it was about sci-fi cowboys, and because I had to make it on a very strict university deadline, I've always felt like there was a lot I just didn't get to include in it. I've also always felt like it would be really fun to take another stab at it someday and just make it bigger, better, and much gayer than I was able to originally. So needless to say, when I remembered the existence of this old comic, I decided that had to be the one I worked on for this video today. So I grabbed one of my print copies off the shelf and rifled through it until I found a page that looked like it would work for this coloring project. And this is the page I ended up going with. Not gonna spoil anything, but it's from a scene towards the end of the story where things are calm and the main characters, West and Lawrence, are having a chat while looking out at the view. As far as the actual story beats go, we've got the bulk of their back and forth dialogue in panel 1, then West says something a little bit more emotionally charged in panel 2, which leads into Lawrence's reaction before they get interrupted and the chat kind of peters out awkwardly in the final panel. Once I had this page picked out, as per usual, I drew up a quick thumbnail sketch to figure out a new layout for the panels. And because the original page felt a bit more cramped than I would have liked, I decided to rearrange the flow of this scene a bit and give it some extra breathing room by turning it from a single page into a whole double-page spread. Panel 1 now takes up an entire page and a bit so that we can really enjoy that view and that scenery. Panel 2 is surprisingly exactly the same as in the original, I just resized it a bit to fit the new layout. And then in order to lean a bit more into the gay undertones that were definitely intended to come through in the original page, I decided to change the sequence of events a little bit as well. So instead of going directly from Lawrence's reaction in panel 3 to them getting interrupted in panel 4, I've changed it so that Lawrence has like an extra thinking moment instead, kind of as if he's trying to find the words to say something important. And then I repurposed the nice low angle from panel 5 to be a reaction face for West. They'd probably still get interrupted on the page right after this though. I don't want to ramble for too long about the layouts, by the way, but it's hard not to, honestly, because personally I just find that like page layouts and the way that different panel arrangements can completely change the feel of the scene that you're drawing to be a really interesting topic. There's a ton that could be said about it for sure, but I think for now the only other technical advice I would want to give specifically for anybody who might want to include double page spreads like this in your own comics is to be very aware of where your margins are. I didn't do the best job of it here because there are still some details that are a bit close to the middle, but basically when you're making a double page spread like this, you really want to make sure not to put any key details like text or faces right down the center of the spread, because then they are going to be impossible to see when the comic is printed and the page is folded down that middle line. Honestly, once you're aware of that fact, if you keep an eye out for it in any kind of comics or manga that you might read, it's something that you will notice all the time, even in much busier, more action-packed kind of spreads. They'll always avoid putting faces and text close to the middle margin of the page. Anyway, that's probably quite enough of me being a nerd about page layouts for the moment, so why don't we move along to the actual painting? Now, usually when working on comic pages, I use an A4 canvas at 600 dpi. So obviously, if you're working on a double page spread, you just want to double the width of that so that you can work on both pages on one single canvas. Once you have your page all set up and ready to go, you can just paste your rough layout or your thumbnail sketch or whatever you want to call it onto the page before lowering the opacity and getting right on with the pencils. I think I mentioned as much in my previous Clip Studio video as well, but my favorite tool for doing any kind of cleanup sketching like this is the darker pencil tool. No particular reason, it just feels the most comfortable for me personally. It feels like it flows pretty well and matches my drawing style. But if perhaps you try it out and the flow of that particular darker pencil doesn't feel right for you and your art style, then no need to worry, because there are an absolute ton of other tool presets and options, both pre-existing in the program and available to download from the Clip Studio asset library. So really you can kind of just experiment and play around and try out a bunch of different things until you find the perfect tool that's going to help you make what you want to make. Now, I mentioned earlier that the whole point of making the first panel here much bigger was to really go in on this scenery shot and make it much more of a centerpiece than it was in the original version of this page. And part of the reason I didn't really go all in on the background back in 2017 was because, for one thing, I just hadn't done as much background work back then as I have now. So I really just didn't feel confident making the scenery more of a central part of that panel, you know what I mean? But also because, as we all know, I never make things easy for myself whenever I'm doing anything creative. I also just really didn't know how the perspective was meant to work back when I first made this page, because I chose to do this panel from a really high angle. Well, I say that, it's a kind of high angle. It's high enough of an angle that the perspective it got confusing and I didn't know what to do with it. But yeah, thankfully this time around I had a couple of handy reference websites and the entirety of the Clip Studio perspective tool arsenal at my disposal, so I felt a lot more confident while sketching it out that I was actually going to be able to pull it off. For a start, I fixed the placement so that the town was actually in front of the characters rather than being entirely body blocked by them, and then I found a reference image at the angle I needed and used it as a super rough base to really roughly block out the shapes and placement of buildings. From there, anyway, the rest of this step basically just consisted of refining the expressions in the rest of the panels on this spread. During the penciling stage, I generally try to block out more of the fine details and fix any janky anatomy or wacky proportions that may have come about in the rough layout. Some panels don't need a ton of detail added to them in order for me to feel like I'm gonna know what needs doing when it comes to the inking stage, but others need a lot of correction. Again though, as with any part of any art process, this is something where the degree of detail is going to vary heavily person to person. For me personally, I tend to enjoy putting detail in the penciling stage like this, but some people will skip this step entirely and go right into the inking. At the end of the day, it really just depends on what works the best for you and what kind of procedure you find the most fun. I don't know if that was the right word for it, procedure. Speaking of the inking anyway, I think I had a slightly different order for doing things in my previous Clip Studio video, but this time around I decided to start off by doing both the paneling and the text before cracking on with the actual character inking and stuff like that. And that was mostly because I really wanted to pay attention to the speech bubbles on this one. In the original comic, for some reason I made all the speech bubbles and the font really big. So you can see on the original version of this page, the dialogue takes up about half the space of the panels when it really doesn't need to. And I think the only reason for that is because back in the day I didn't really have a decent grasp of what kind of font sizes were the standard, or what kind of font sizes would still be readable when it was printed, so just to err on the side of caution, I made everything really, really big. With the size of canvas that I normally use nowadays, though, I found that a font between roughly like 7 and 15 size tends to be ideal for staying readable when the page is printed, while also not taking up a ridiculous amount of space. So that's the size I used here. I also tried to make sure that the actual speech bubbles themselves were only as big as they needed to be in order to fit that particular size of text inside of them. And it may be very faint, but I also had my page size guide included in my layout layer here, which kind of helped me to make sure not to put any text outside of the printing safe zone area. That's definitely another thing you want to be mindful of when putting in any speech bubbles in a comic, is making sure that none of them are too close to the edge of the page, because they will probably get cut off. Hello, Future Alex here doing the edit. Just jumping in here to say that I only do my page margins that way, like as an actual layer in my artwork, because I prefer to use illustration canvases whenever I'm working on comic pages. But if you want to use one of Clip Studio's actual comic canvases for your work, then you can actually set your page margins in the program itself. You can set up your page margins for a new comic canvas by going to, obviously, make a new page, and selecting the comic canvas option. Then you hit all comic settings and go to the safety margins section. There you can put in all the numbers and measurements that you need to make them fit whatever kind of size that you need them to be. There are also options for setting up guidelines for the binding size, the bleed width, and inner border, but the safety margin is the one you want to pay attention to for your speech bubbles specifically. Speaking of the speech bubbles, actually, I used the balloon subtool to draw them because it's just the most convenient way ever to do them. It lets you draw the bubble in any shape that you want, edit that shape, add a tail, and also makes it so that any text you type on top of the balloon is physically attached to it as part of the same layer, rather than, making them two separate layers and then you have to deal with them each on their own individually. It just really simplifies the process. There are a bunch of presets you can use, but for this one, I actually made my own. I've kind of been getting into making my own Clip Studio assets recently, and this was my first foray into making a speech bubble asset, and I think it went pretty well. I'm quite happy with the way it looks. It took a bit of figuring out, to be fair, and honestly the process could probably cover a whole nother video on its own, but I really wanted bubbles with a slightly hand-drawn kind of look to them to match the cowboy vibes. So yeah, I just made my own. Alternatively, if you don't want to faff about with all of that kind of learning curve of how to make your own stuff, there are plenty of other hand-drawn looking balloons that you can download from the asset library. It might be a bit more noticeable later on as well, but I also used the layer color option to really easily turn the speech bubbles either green or blue depending on which character they belong to. It's not the kind of thing I would normally do for a black and white manga page, but considering this is going to be a full color kind of artwork spread, whatever you want to call it, I just figured it would help to maybe differentiate who's speaking a little bit. For the paneling anyway, I used the frame border tool. I think I explained how it works in a bit more detail in my previous Clip Studio video, so I'll try not to repeat myself if I can avoid it, but basically it allows you to draw a panel and then divide it up into smaller panels with perfectly even guttering, and each of those individual panels basically exists as its own layer folder, which keeps everything inside of it neat and tidy and prevents anything from going outside the lines. You should be able to see here actually, even when I had to transform the final panel a bit to make it fit to the edge of the page, because I was using the frame border tool, it automatically maintained that gap between that final panel and the panels directly above it. So no matter how I squished and resized and adjusted the angle of that final panel, the size of the guttering between those two areas stayed exactly the same, no matter what I was doing. It is so convenient. I cannot tell you how many times I've been working in like other programs and I've had to completely redo my paneling because I messed up the angle on like one part. It's exactly the kind of shortcut that makes life a whole lot easier for any comic artists who are just trying to get their stuff done quickly, and yeah, I could go on and on, honestly, but I'm just a really big fan of that feature. It's pretty good. So now that those panels are all laid out anyway, it's time to crack on with the inking. You can see here I started off with the character close-up in panel 5, and as I said, if you're working inside of the panel folders, you physically won't be able to draw outside of them. So I actually ended up making a separate individual folder just for this character because he needed to overlap and break through the top of the panel just a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some other kind of workaround for that though, just because Clip Studio feels like the kind of program where they really have thought of everything. But for me personally, I just wanted to kind of go with the quick solution of making another non-panel folder to draw this character in, just because that seemed like the easiest route for me. When it comes to the actual inking anyway, my favorite pen for that is still the one called Real G Pen. It's one of the default ones that comes with the program, but I've adjusted the dynamic settings so that the minimum value is about 30, just because that matches my style of line work quite a bit better than the original default settings. And the reason that that one is still my favorite pen to ink with, even after having been using this program for quite a while and doing a bit of experimenting, is because it's got this little bit of texture to it that makes it feel much more organic to look at, but also makes it feel really natural to draw with. Yeah, I legitimately couldn't tell you why, I'm not quite sure, but for some reason doing character inking like this feels so much closer to the feeling of drawing on paper when I do it in Clip Studio compared to pretty much any other drawing software that I've used. And that's really nice because, I don't know about you guys, but I often feel like my drawings have a different kind of vibe, like a different energy when I do them on paper compared to when I do them digitally. Maybe it's because a lot of digital programs have rounded brushes and they make everything look a lot smoother, while this one has just so many pens and tools and options that kind of bridge the gap between traditional and digital, or at least they look like they do, and kind of bring you back to that grainy paper doodling in a sketchbook kind of feeling. And that's quite nice. Also, fun little design change here for the characters. Originally, West is a lizard person, by the way. So in the original comic, I drew the scales on his face with a couple of crisscross lines. That was my default way of depicting that. But nowadays, my shorthand for any character with scales is to add some rounded triangle shapes to their skin. I might make a custom brush for that at some point actually, but this time around I just kept on using the Real G Pen, but reduced the actual brush size so that the lines would come out a bit thinner. And that's also what I did for any areas of just finer detail on this sort of project. For some of the scenery detail, I also got to use a handful of different decoration brushes, which, if you remember from last time, are honestly some of my favorite features of Clip Studio as a whole. They make filling in areas of foliage and clothing detail so much easier, and I wish every program had them. They're pretty much the main reason I've actually been wanting to kind of switch to using Clip as my main program, actually. Just because they are so convenient, and I crave expediency in my line work because I keep doing really detailed line work designs, and the decoration brushes would be so helpful for everything I do. Anyway, I'm going off track. So yeah, hopefully you can see here that I whipped out a couple of decoration brushes for the grass and the flowers and foliage and stuff like that, and it made what would usually be a very finicky kind of process take about 2 seconds. So yeah, again, big fan of that. Anyway, the final part of the inking process here was the town in the first panel's background. And if the angle of this panel had been a bit more straight on, I might have been able to actually use another decoration brush or some other kind of Clip Studio asset to fill it in. But instead, what I ended up doing was creating a vanishing point with the perspective ruler tool and then filling in all of the rooftops by hand. When you add a vanishing point with the perspective tool like this, as long as the ruler is visible, basically any line that you draw will automatically follow it towards the center, which makes mapping out townscapes like this a whole lot easier. You can even pin your vanishing point way off from your canvas in the kind of negative grey area of the Clip Studio workspace for any really extreme angles where you need the horizon to be quite far off camera. You just turn it on and fill in any lines that need to go off into the horizon, and then turn it off while you fill in any of the more wiggly kind of details. Thankfully, because the town I was drawing here is far enough away in the distance, I didn't really feel like I needed to put a ton of detail into the buildings. But if I had gone freehand with the perspective, even a really basic town made of cubes like this could very easily end up being noticeably misaligned with the horizon and just throwing off the vibe of the entire drawing. So yeah, 10 out of 10 would recommend using the perspective ruler. It is an absolute lifesaver. Very good show. Now, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, we have arrived in uncharted waters, because this is the part of the process I have never done before: coloring a comic page in Clip Studio. I mean, hell, forget a comic page. Before working on this, I genuinely had never colored anything in Clip Studio before. So, to start off with, I pulled up the original page and made a new layer to swatch some of the colors onto as a palette, and then I kinda just went for it. Once again, I decided to start off with the close-up in the bottom right corner and then kind of work my way up to the big scenery shot in panel 1. mostly because I think faces are one of the things I draw and colour the most often, so I guess I hoped that the actual methods and processes of colouring would feel familiar enough to be workable, even if the actual painting tools maybe didn't, because I haven't used them before. I think my main worry was that I remember back when I first started getting back into using Clip Studio at the start of this year, it took me a while to get used to the inking pens and find which settings worked for me. So yeah, I was slightly concerned that it might also take me ages to find a colouring brush that worked with my style and the sort of visual I was trying to achieve. Happily though, it ended up taking maybe 2 minutes. If you've seen a lot of my videos before, you might be familiar with my colouring style by now, but it basically involves a lot of gradients and cell shading that sometimes gets blended out depending on where the colour is being applied, like blush on the cheeks and stuff like that. I started out by trying some of the actual paintbrush tools from the thick paint subcategory to the watercolour subcategory, but they were a bit too painty for what I was trying to do. They would definitely be great for anybody with a more painty art style, but I was looking for something a bit more solid. So, out of curiosity, I took another look at the pen tab and found that there was actually another subcategory next to the inking pens called markers. The tool I ended up using for most of the shading on this one was the very memorably named marker pen tool. There were 1 or 2 other marker tools that kind of darkened the colour if you backtracked over yourself and went over any of your previous brush strokes, but this one didn't do that, which meant that it was basically exactly what I was looking for. Also, you may already have picked up on the fact that the original page was only done in flat colour, and again that was something I kind of had to limit myself to because of the time constraints I was under while making the comic in the first place, and actually also because I remember I was really trying to emulate the style of this indie comic that I was really into at the time called Hot Blood, but nowadays I feel like I'm very comfortable in my own colouring style, and I also wasn't working to a crazy strict uni deadline this time around, so I really wanted to go all out with the colouring rather than just doing it in flat colour like the original page. Oh, and a bit of a topic jump here, but I should probably confess that because I'm still getting to grips with the panel folders and just the whole colouring in Clip Studio thing as a whole, I used a really roundabout method for selecting the areas I wanted to actually colour while I was working on this. I don't think I'm gonna bother trying to explain to you all exactly how I went about it because it really was quite convoluted. But basically I found out after I was already done recording that there is a version of the Magic Wand tool in Clip Studio with the name Selection for Referred Layers, which pretty much makes it so that if you set the automatically generated background layer of your panel folder as a reference layer, then you don't need to worry about the fact that your line work might extend past the edge of the panel and be open-ended in those parts where you can't see it because the panel is keeping it hidden away all neat and tidy. It just kind of takes note of where the edge is based on that background layer and closes the gap for you, which is pretty handy because it gives you one less thing to have to worry about. Also, you may have already noticed, but while working on this page I decided to go around and colour all of the characters before colouring any of the backgrounds. As I say, I don't really do comic colouring often or at all, but that felt like the most sensible way to go about it just because the characters obviously each have a predefined palette already. And I figured that if I got all of those definite colours laid out first, it would make it a bit easier to balance the background colours around them. I also adjusted a few of the colours on the characters' palettes while I was working on them here, like West's skin tone and Lawrence's kind of overall outfit. I made it a bit darker and a bit more blue, just to bring them round to a bit more of the saturated kind of colouring style I have nowadays and make them feel a bit less washed out than they did in the original 2017 version of this page. Now, when it came to actually colouring the backgrounds, especially on this big scenery panel, I did mostly use colours lifted from the original page, but I tried to arrange them in a much more readable way. And the way I did that was by paying much more attention to the actual light and dark values of the colours, rather than just, you know, whether they were red or orange or whatever. What that means is that rather than laying a bunch of equally dark areas of colour right on top of each other like I did in the original page, I tried to make sure that the areas closest to the foreground were the darkest, and then have the different planes of the drawing get lighter and lighter the further into the distance they were. You should be able to see what I mean in just a second, but as an example, I made sure that the rock in the bottom left was coloured with the very darkest brown, and then the sandy town and mountains in the background were filled with much lighter yellows and oranges than anything in the foreground. Honestly, I can never stress enough just how helpful this kind of colouring technique is for giving your artwork a much clearer feeling of depth and just lifting everything in it up a little bit. It's the kind of thing where even if you put a black and white filter over the whole picture and squinted, you should still be able to read all of the silhouettes really clearly because the different values of light and dark help everything to stand out properly against each other. In terms of the actual painting anyway, I actually ended up having a lot more fun working on the scenery than I thought I would. Probably because it gave me another chance to break out the decoration brushes, which we all know I always enjoy. For the rocks in the foreground, I used a couple of scratchy line brushes that I downloaded from the asset library to give them a bit more of a subtle texture without having to rely on heavy black ink. And for the town in the background, it might be really faint, but I tried to add a bit of color variation to it with this like watercolor triangle brush that I also picked up recently, and I quite like how it turned out. I also used another custom brush to add some petals to the scene to give it just a little bit more movement. My favourite part of painting this scenery though had to be filling in the clouds. I downloaded another custom brush pack the other day, and the entire time I was working on this piece, I was so excited to get to use them. Just like, oh my gosh, these are going to work so well, I can't wait, they're going to look so fluffy, and I'm very happy to report that they did not disappoint. They were really fun to use. I used the airbrush tool to fill in a bit more of a customized yellow to orange gradient in the background, and then I just painted these clouds right on top, and needless to say, I really love how they turned out. I also broke out the perspective ruler again to add some rays to the sun on the horizon, along with using the border effect button to really quickly give the whole layer a thin yellow outline. One kind of unspoken rule of thumb with comics that I'm very thankful for is that you don't have to draw an actual detailed background in every single panel. As long as you indicate the scenery often enough for your readers to be able to keep up with the general placement of characters as the scene goes on, then that's totally fine. I think the metric that I've seen the most popular artists and mangakas use in their work is having at least one panel with a background per page, and that could be a big panel, it could be a small panel. As long as there's one, it kind of helps to maintain that context. But yeah, it can actually be really helpful for keeping your pages less cluttered and making sure that they stay readable when you do leave some panels completely devoid of background detail. So because the main panel here has so much going on scenery-wise, for the most part I just filled in the rest of the panel backgrounds with simple blocks of yellow and, in the case of panel 5, a few more rocks and clouds. And with that little bit of advice in mind, we actually find ourselves here arriving at the end of the colouring process, which means that this massive double-page spread is all done. So why don't we go and take a look at the before and after. Well, there we have it. One flat color comic page completely transformed into a fully rendered spread with a bunch more breathing room. I honestly couldn't be happier with how this page turned out. I'm genuinely really proud of it, especially given that I haven't colored in this program before. I thought it would be scary, but this has kind of turned into a very successful experiment, if I do say so myself. It was also just really nice to be able to revisit this story for a page or two and give it a fresh coat of paint, because it's one that I really enjoy. And hey, if you enjoyed seeing what Clip Studio can do and you want to give it a go for yourself, you may be happy to hear that they do have a free trial available. And what's more, it lasts for 3 whole months. There's going to be a download link for that in the description, and if this whole video didn't make it obvious already, I would definitely recommend it. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you had as much fun as I did, and if you want to see more videos like this, or if you have any ideas for other creative stuff you'd like me to try, go ahead and let me know down in the comments. For now though, I hope you're all staying as safe, happy, and healthy as you possibly can, and I'll see you next time.